Good evening to Jan van Eyck Academy, to the online-offline program, Transforming Institutions. I'm super happy to have a couple of the participants and team members in the auditorium. Very happy to welcome the online public for the talk that we're going to have today with Alison Tickell. Transforming Institutions is a new series of lectures and conversations that is identifying the current environmental crisis as a systemic crisis and tries to acknowledge the unique significance of culture in this context. And it explores the obstacles and the possibilities of cultural institutions to become more both responsive and resilient towards the climate emergency and its interlinked socio-cultural crisis. Last Transforming Institutions, we had the pleasure to have Rolando Vasquez here, who was speaking about decoloniality and the relationship with social justice and climate justice. And now we are welcoming Alison Tickell. Hi, Alison, who is the founder of Judys Bicycle. And I'm super happy to have her here because I really feel that she's an ally in the quest to connect cultural policy and culture to the climate action. And she has been doing that for quite a long time. And so I'm really pleased and happy that she's here. Judys Bicycle is a non-profit organization in London, which is mobilizing the arts and culture to take action on the climate and ecological crisis. And since 2017, it has established an extensive methodology for environmental change through culture. Bringing together environmental and cultural expertise with a comprehensive resource library, tools, benchmarks, and evidence-based research. Judys Bicycle has also recently issued a call to action for governments in parallel to COP26 in order to start accounting for the ways in which cultural and artistic communities can contribute to limiting climate change. And Alison Tickell, you yourself have been a musician first. And you started in the music industry, which is really interesting. It would be nice also to talk about a little bit how you started Judys Bicycle. And yeah, I think I'm going to leave it to you. You can do your keynote of about 25 minutes, and then afterwards we can pose a little bit of questions. So I'll leave it to you. And welcome everybody, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Hicham, and thank you everybody for joining this talk. I'm really very honoured to be here tonight, yeah, thank you everybody for coming. I'm actually going to share my screen because I have got some slides, so you don't have to look at me all the time. So, as Hicham says, I'm Alison from Judys Bicycle. We're an NGO mobilising arts and culture on climate action, founded by the UK music industry, actually in 2007, not 17. So we've been here for a long time, and now we're working internationally across the arts. Nearly 15 years ago, Judys Bicycle set out with three core beliefs that still guide us to this day. One, that culture and the arts have to be at the heart of the global response to the climate crisis, and they're not. Two, that bringing our collective imagination and joint purpose to this challenge is the most valuable and inspiring work we can be doing as a creative community. And three, action comes in many guises and everything counts. And this moment, where climate change is taking centre stage for so many of us, we have some really clear choices. We can either remodel our societies and our patterns of consumption and the licence we give to polluters to operate at our expense, or we cannot. We can address issues of equity and justice in how we make those choices, or we cannot. Let me explain. The climate crisis is a cultural crisis. At its heart is the unchallenged assumption of the supremacy of an extractive and materialist ideology industrialized by us Europeans. This ideology has created an enduringly uneven global economic system which has dispossessed millions of people of land and livelihoods and is catastrophically degrading the natural world. The climate and ecological crisis is about justice. The poorest communities with the least culpability or capacity to cope are experiencing the most devastating consequences. Some 1% of the global of the global population experience reality as superconsumption, and that is us. At the other end of the scale, the figures are persistently distressing. Millions of people living on less than $2 a day in 2020. Most of these people come from two regions, Southern Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Climate migration is already estimated as including 20 million people in 2020 alone, and that was a pandemic year. This displacement is a result of the devastation of climate change. Where do all these people go when we're busy closing borders and tensions are rising? And then there is the other justice issue, which is around the natural world, justice and stewardship of all those beings that are not human. Decades after the 1992 Earth Summit, climate action is still an ideological and political battleground. Despite all the conferences, all the commitments, the global response to climate change is still woefully inadequate. An obvious reason is the cost, but this is dwarfed by the expense of not taking action. The real reason, harder to solve, is that the call to action around the global crisis is, of course, a great reckoning. It exposes the failures of the current global economic order and reveals how this drives inequality and degradation of our life support systems, which is, of course, the natural world. It asks all nation states to work together with richer economies doing the heavy lifting. This challenging, for sure, but completely possible call for global cooperation wasn't heard once again at the recent COP26 climate talks, and we're still on a path collectively to over 2 degrees warming, which is catastrophic. Global climate governance, assigned mainly to the United Nations, has not yet succeeded in building consensus for rapid action. And this is because the story of climate change actually is told in the buried histories of human conquest, in extinctions and degrading land and sea, and anchored in cultural values that underpin human supremacy over all else and some humans more than others. The climate crisis is a cultural crisis, the consequence of myths and stories that permeate our lives. Sorry, let's go back to the second. I've missed a slide. The root metaphors and narratives that we live by, nature as a machine, nature as hostile, nature as something to be exploited, engineered, sold, sentimentalized, improved, what critic Val Plumwood describes as the foundational delusion of the West, are as wrong as they're strong. The climate crisis is nature's way of interrupting these pernicious myths. If nature were understood as a web of life, a teacher, a giving parent, creative beyond our wildest imaginations, as many indigenous commentators and ecologists argue, perhaps climate change would simply be that, change, not crisis. Narratives about nature, including the arts, conform to a similar worldview. The creative industries are valued, especially by policymakers, as tools of the economy, and the arts and culture are frequently used to reinforce the stories behind any particular worldview. An obvious example is the stories about how public statues are celebrating past slavers and how museum collections were acquired. These have become culture wars, diametrically opposed views of history and civilization. And not far from this idea is the idea that art and design is neutral, autonomous, artistic freedom trumping all other considerations. This utterly fails to account for power dynamics and context. Who gets to be an artist? How did they get there? Who gets to design and for whom? Who gets to travel, to exhibit, even to learn the tools of the trade in the first place? This is absolutely central to the climate crisis, because underneath all the layers of scientific data and evidence pointing at fossil fuels is another reason. Assumptions about what matters, who owns who, and what and who gets to benefit. This is difficult territory. It's uncomfortable, but we, especially we, the makers and custodians of culture and creativity, and therefore the makers of the world, we cannot afford to turn away. The magic power of the arts is in the experience. Art in all its forms, fashion, design, music, film, poetry, drama, can tell us something profound, can bring people together and reinforce community and identity. Its essence is a sensual experience of meaning. And right now, we need art to help us breathe with sensual imagination into the essence of this beautiful planet. So a little bit about Judys Bicycle. We were founded just before the UK music industry became the first country in the world to enshrine carbon reduction targets into law. The arts, like any other sector, have an ecological footprint. Judys Bicycle set out to understand the nature of the challenge in real terms. What would it take to work within the ecological constraints of our planet? Unleashing the energy of the creative community, invigorating values that restore our understanding of belonging within nature was the real objective. And Judys Bicycle decided that what we needed to do was to translate the climate crisis into day-to-day currency by creating sector-specific expertise and resources that inspire words and action. In other words, what would it take to embody climate action? Doing itself will rewire our brains much more effectively, actually, than thinking about it. And we know this now when we look at neuroscience and what's coming from that. Our premise is that this itself, this rewiring through action, will empower the arts to champion ambitious climate action across civil society. This embodiment is going to breathe life, inspiration, joy into the arts themselves. Working closely with the music industry, Judys Bicycle generated an enduring methodology for greenhouse gas emissions analysis, carbon calculators for cultural and creative activities such as buildings, tours, festivals, productions that are now used across the globe. We have about 5,000 current organisations and artists measuring their greenhouse gas emissions. This is invaluable data, but crucially what it does also is to empower the arts by providing basic literacy as a starting point for really understanding that we do have an impact, it does matter, and that therefore we can do something about it. It really creates agency. We also set about supporting networks, conversations, one-to-one advice and support, research. In short, being there to convert the precious action that comes out of the precious energy to agency when people wanted to help. It's important to say that we didn't start with the artists. Culture, just like any other sector, is an ecosystem. Changes to one component are felt by all. And so instead of focusing just on artists or on art, we looked at the whole, supporting all parts of the ecosystem to together rethink cultural practice and create a reinforcing spiral of change. In 2012, we were hugely supported by Arts Council England, our national funding body for the arts, who embarked upon the largest programme of environmental literacy for their community anywhere in the world by making environmental requirements a condition of funding. This was a partnership with Judys Bicycle. So all the national portfolio organisations the Arts Council supported, currently some 823 companies receiving core support over multiple years, were required to measure environmental impacts. To do that, they used our Creative Green tools and they had to submit a policy and an action plan. This gave us lots of data. So the last report, there is the data. It gives us a total carbon footprint, sources of impacts, and also what each part of the arts community, what their carbon footprint was. But importantly, it also gave us lots more really interesting information about governance, about commissioning, about well-being, which accompanied all of that data. Those stories of change have been critical, but the most important part of our work was to inspire the sector and to learn from them. So a rich dialogue of advice and support networks, events and themes have animated that data, making it real and subservient to the bigger challenge of transformation. Judys Bicycle was initially contracted to run the programme for 3 years, and by the time we complete the current contract in 2023, it will have run for over a decade. And that's provided some really rich data, benchmarks, understanding of case studies, what good practice looks like, but really galvanised the sector. Results are great. They show an annual reduction of about 4.5% over a decade. That's very significant. Lots of saved money from the Arts Council's point of view, so about £20 million, that's about €24 million. But crucially, that breathing in to this as an issue of critical cultural concern. Over time, the partnership has developed and evolved to be more demanding. 2018 to 22 outputs include developing net zero targets and pathways for the largest energy users of the Arts Council. Some 30 major institutions such as South Bank Centre, the National Theatre, the Royal Opera House, covering around 80 buildings, which collectively reduced their emissions by 18% in 1 year. And this is really critical. This is the way that that we need to be thinking about our work. This decade of data gathering and collective cultural learning has generated credible and robust evidence, which makes a really good case for scaling action. Starting from the basics, a carbon footprint, the Arts Council's deceptively simple policy is demonstrating how a sustainable cultural sector might actually work. This vital perspective on culture, seen through the lens of our environment, has stimulated so much debate and passion and catalysed a really critical dialogue about the purpose of the arts more widely. Internationally, there is a need to build sustainability into cultural policies. Of course, culture is hampered by a lack of evidence, data, to make the case for ambitious changes and investment in culture at a policy level, a lack which prevents also cultural voices from contributing to solutions. Design is absolutely crucial, and speaking to power. The Climate Heritage Network has recently succeeded in getting cultural heritage representation on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and on the G20, which is a significant step in the right direction. But artists, the creative community, creative industries should be absolutely central to this challenge. Overall, there is a patchy applications of national policies and resources, notwithstanding some inspirational examples, but cultural policymakers, particularly at the national level, have not reached consensus that the climate crisis matters enough. So in 2010, in the 6 months preceding COP26, Judys Bicycle, in partnership with the British Council, decided to see where national climate policies all over the world aligned with cultural policies. A combination of desk-based research, a survey sent to over 200 ministries, interviews and a series of really interesting in-depth roundtables in Turkey, Indonesia, Nigeria, Colombia and the UK sought to illuminate policy commitments and perhaps broader governance trends. we found that in a nutshell, cultural policy priorities are not yet reading across to commitments to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, environmental justice and transitions. This is in spite of 197 countries as signatories to the Paris Agreement, and this is a real dissonance that we have. All these countries have submitted climate change targets and pathways, creating a basic architecture, and yet culture is not part of that. In spite of the Paris Agreement, climate action in culture is still very rare. I know that this is changing, but we need to work very fast and explicitly read across to commitments to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, to environmental discourse on justice and on transition. We also found that many of the priorities of national cultural policies are environmental issues, especially as they concern cultural rights, focus on place and community, and social inclusion. So actually this is low-hanging fruit. We just need to read across our commitments as cultural stewards to climate and the environment. Many cities, local authorities, municipalities do have a focus on climate and environment at local levels. There's huge amount of grassroots activity. There's a huge amount of knowledge and expertise, particularly at the hyper-local level, and this should be informing national policy. So a dialogue really does need to be created, which starts from the ground up to inform national policy and meet where culture can meet international targets, national commitments, and grassroots expertise around culture. And at that point, we will have a transformative cultural agenda. All cultural decisions should prioritise the environmental crisis, particularly in the years before 2030. We are wasting time. We have none of it to lose. We need to get moving. And there are already so many communities of practice. There is so much work to be done. But of course, policy on its own isn't enough. We need a movement. We need to think about movement building, which is based on honest and authentic leadership, values and purpose, focused without blinking on Mother Earth and all of us who rely on her bounty. In 2017, Judys Bicycle looked across to ask ourselves, well, what is movement building? And we found that all over the world, there are creative pioneers, very often grassroots, indigenous practitioners working at the extremely local level who have dedicated their work, their lives, their expertise, their artistry, their creativity to protecting, stewarding, repairing Mother Earth. These people are pioneers. They are the new creative and cultural practice, but very often they're on their own. They're unsupported. In many regions of the earth, it's a dangerous endeavour to be an environmental activist. Literally, people are putting their lives on the line. And what we found was a loneliness and also a deep vulnerability where people felt they had no networks, no support, their work wasn't being recognised. And this precious, valuable knowledge, these extraordinary cultural pioneers were getting lost. So we launched a programme dedicated to creative climate justice and leadership, specifically to support these artists and activists on the frontier of culture. It's over the years we've run 5 or 6 creative climate leadership programmes. It's a group of exceptionally committed, mainly grassroots artists and activists who are a glimpse into our future. They have shown respect for people in relation to one another, and to nature, who have slowed down enough to listen to what is being asked of them and sped up in response to the call to action, who appreciate this delicate balance is not a paradox. It is the essence of art, the invitation to appreciate and respond to this very particular moment. We are all connected to the world around us, a dynamic interplay of endless action and reaction. And so, of course, are the arts, weaving together our experiences of body, soul, and sense into ways of knowing that resonate deeply. I personally took a while to understand the real nature of the climate crisis, that the turning in to grief and loss, and through that to connection, was the thing. When I founded Judys Bicycle, I thought a carbon footprint was enough, that with diligence and a plan to reduce our impacts, we could ride this wave. But I was wrong. I had to fall into it, experience what it feels like to be at the mercy of forces way beyond my strength, to be out of breath, to have my ears roaring, and miraculously to float. And that is my privilege. Putting this privilege in service to Mother Earth is the clarion call. I invite you to listen because this call is absolute. Thank you.
Sorry, Alison, just 1 second. Yeah, thank you so much, Alison. And now we find ourselves in the awkward situation that I'm looking at a screen because we kind of decided that to limit our climate kilometers, to invite some people that are around that would be invited physically, and some people we do online. And this also takes us to quite weird situations in a sense, because in effect, the ecological crisis, or thinking about the ecological crisis, has an effect on how we produce and how we move forward as cultural practitioners. I have I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then I'll give it also to the crowd in order to ask you questions. But the question that most lingers with me, a question that I get asked a lot, is why culture? Why culture? Because isn't it the larger companies that need to do their bit? Isn't it about the larger perspective? Why is culture complicit in this? Could you maybe elaborate on that?
So there's two questions under that, Hicham. Why is culture complicit, but also why culture? Mm-hmm. And the answer, I think, is that first of all, just in a very mechanistic way, culture, and I include in that creative industries, the arts and heritage. Culture is the maker of our world. In terms of creative industries, it's design, it's fashion, it's architecture. It's so much of it is the plasticity is around us. It's actually the nuts and bolts of how we live. And of course, embedded in all of that are cultural assumptions about what's important to make our world into. The arts are about experience. They're about an aesthetic, a deeply sensual experience, and heritage is about the creating of myths and symbols into meaning, habits, behaviours. So in that regard, culture is, of course, absolutely fundamental. It is both, and neither is it neutral. It's both the maker of our world, but also the visionary. It contains within it so much of hidden and explicit value and a lifestyle. And it still baffles me that it has taken so long for, not just for culture actually, and this is a challenge for culture, not just for the cultural and creative community, to recognise just how hugely responsible we have been and are, but also for the climate community to understand that actually this is not going to be solved if you throw data at people or you chuck some technology at this challenge. This is about people. It's about how people feel. It's about how people commune with them, with one another, with themselves. But also, it's actually about how people behave around consumption. The advertising industry knows that very well. We need to think about that for ourselves as well.
Yeah, exactly. The advertising industry is reminiscent of this idea of culture on steroids, almost.
Yeah.
Creating worldviews. In fact,
Exactly.
but would you make a distinction between the arts and culture, as culture is the larger idea of how we view the world, and the arts is sort of the little brother or sister of culture, one might say? No?
Culture is another of those very ambivalent words. It means all sorts of different things. I do think that there is a sort of sweet spot with the arts. It's like a distillation, if you like, of a lot of culture. When I talk about culture, I generally am speaking about creative industries, arts, and heritage. Not the broader sociological context of culture, but of course they are deeply and intimately connected. I suppose when I talk about culture, I'm talking about a community a community, I suppose, of sectors. But of course, everything is so connected and reinforcing.
Sure. And why do you think that culture has been up till now excluded from the discussion around climate action?
Because culture, well, first of all, I think part of it is because culture is considered not material, wrong, an incorrect assumption. It's always suffered from because it's about experience. We have a very materially based assumption of value, and our economy is so strongly based on material worth. Culture has always had challenges in justifying itself. You don't just see this just in the climate space. And it's also very often considered to be fundamentally about instrumentalizing the work that we do. So it's not been understood. I think this is changing. I was at COP26, which are the climate summit talks in November in Glasgow. And we saw more representation of culture, particularly outside the talks, than I've ever seen before. And people are beginning to realise that actually this issue, like so many, but this issue particularly, really does need to be mediated through different meanings. It's not fundamentally about consumption.
Right. And can you also explain to us a little bit this double-edged sword of culture is the problem, culture is the solution, in fact? Because there's this happening.
Because underneath a cultural manifestation are, of course, values. It's what we care about, what we choose to manifest in whatever form. And underneath that, we have, I think this is an invitation to really think about how we are expressing, how we are feeling our way into a much deeper, profounder, richer experience of what it is to be a human being in communion with not just other human beings, but in communion with Mother Earth. And that actually is a very transformative agenda, and the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, is a transformative crisis. Without that journey that I've been on personally, and I'm sure many people who are or might be listening to this will have been on personal journeys which are really asking ourselves what it is that's being asked of us and how we might connect differently to our experience on our short experiences on this earth and see the world in a different way. This is not new. These perspectives are not new. They are not new at all. In fact, they go back thousands of years. But we have lost that capacity to open our hearts and minds to a different level of connection over particularly the last 50 years. And that's the invitation. And I think culture, the arts, design, creative industries really can take on not just the responsibility of changing the way that we work, but also that deeper existential responsibility about creating a different way of inviting people to be part of that. And that's what makes us different. It is also what makes us deeply compelling and deeply responsible.
Yeah, and maybe if we bring that a little bit down to the arts, how can we move beyond sort of, culture as a vehicle for cultural policy towards when we speak of adding culture to the equation, usually from the other parties, culture is being seen, or the arts is being seen as a way to visualize mostly the problematics that we are dealing with. So usually culture is seen as a visualization tool, or the art is being seen as a visualization tool. I mean, we experienced the same thing when we started out with the Intergovernmental Panel on Art and Climate Change as part of the Urgency Intensive that we did last year. And two of the IPCC members, their ideas of how to incorporate culture were mostly related to visualization processes.
Yeah.
In let's say modeling practices, and we see the same thing when we are working with universities. We see the same thing, and how can we create a better crossover? How can we have this discussion that we're having? Culture is a worldview, is a world making practice, right? We are making worlds. Culture is the world, in fact.
Yeah.
And this way, culture is also the change, in fact, because if we change our culture, we change the world, right? So how can we get to that point?
So that's such a good
with
question.
Policymakers. Yeah, with policymakers specifically. Yeah.
For policymakers.
Well, for policymakers and for let's say for the crossover itself.
Yeah, I think the trick to this is that we need to embody change. It's not enough to and Hicham, what you're describing is so common. It's why we didn't start with the art, because actually that's the starting point usually to commission something on climate change. Let's commission a piece of work. Actually, where is the integrity in that? This has to be an embodied experience. And so to policymakers, I would always say, understand that this is a system. That culture is a system, like all, as I said, like all sectors, all communities. And actually what we do know is that you have to embody this change in order to really feel it, really work your way into it. And through that experience of actually embodying the change, what opens out is an endless set of possibilities, including what you put into the world, but how you put it into the world, who you put it into, in community with whom, is the great invitation. And it is an unraveling, because as you unpick that experience, what is revealed is how we got here, why we got here, and therefore what needs to happen next. And I get very frustrated by commissioners, policymakers who assume that the answer is in another commission. It isn't. It's in enabling the cultural sector in its nuts and bolts to really meet this climate challenge through rethinking and transforming how they do.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to give it to the public. One thing we're debating here a lot is if you bring it down to our particular case of being an international residency where we have artists around that produce work, and we are talking about material transition in terms of mobility. and these kind of things. How do we make it so we do not corner the artists, but support the artist in a sense? And yeah, how do we choose between the carrot and the stick, let's say?
Okay,
Yeah.
so obviously the first thing is that artists will do what they do. They do what they do. They will find a way of responding to this, and we're seeing it everywhere. Creative practice at the moment is so inspiring and so ambitious. So the first thing I think is that the idea of what is constraint. There is very creative constraint, and I think that this is a responsibility again of the creative sector at large. When Judys Bicycle started, we asked ourselves, well, what is it that is going to that is going to empower artists in this space? And I think what will empower artists is a system, a context in which they work that is really supporting these values. So again, going back to that wider holistic view, there's something really fundamental about asking, well, what is good creative curation from our point of view? And it has to be about the context in which artists are working. So if you underpin that work, whatever that work is, whether it's about climate and environment or not, with a really strong reinforcing ethical context for that work, that will support artists. The other thing to say is that, I started with saying artists will do what they do. They will. So, our role always as creative custodians of artists and designers and makers is to create a supportive framework for whatever it is that they do. And that goes back to doing things as well as ethically as we possibly can.
So basically, you wouldn't choose between the carrot or the stick, but you're calling it a supportive system. But at a certain point, moving upward in time, if there is this transition of 10 years or up till 2030, we need to have emissions. At a certain point, there will be policy on a higher level.
Yeah.
So how do we cope with that?
So I'm not, I'm not squeamish about the stick, actually.
Sure.
Just to say, I'm not, I think that we have a monumental task in front of us. We can't leave this up to chance. And one of the most important things about that we learnt with the Arts Council England's policy requirement, and the emphasis is on that word requirement, is that a light touch requirement changes everything. And I think that now we need to understand that the stakes are really high. We need to make the right decisions at the moment, and policymakers have an incredibly important role in that, which is to create the frameworks, the investment, and the supportive narrative that is going to reinforce and reward good, wise decisions and make it very difficult to make the wrong ones, because we have got a very material problem on our hands, which is the problem of not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also a whole host of other issues around toxicity, chemical waste, around a desperately degrading natural world. There's a point at which just leaving this up to the good endeavour of individuals is just not appropriate. It's not fair, and it's not ethical.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Alison. I'm going to ask the crowd if they have a question. Questions? Everybody's tired. You wanna post the first one? Okay.
Hi, Alison. Thank you so much
Hi.
for this amazing energy and for your presentation.
Yeah.
My name is Bruno. I'm curator of Jan van Eyck. And I'd like to invite everyone here and online to post questions. I think everyone's still digesting. And I mean, I have a more meta and maybe more personal question. You've been working with this for more than a decade, and there's still so much energy and hope and resilience. And last year we had, as part of the Urgency Intensive, a beautiful conversation with public philosopher Roman Krznaric, who wrote a book
Yeah.
called The Good Ancestor,
Yeah.
How to Think Long Term in a Short Term World. And he was talking a little bit of this tug and war between short-termness and long-term thinking. And I'm really curious to have to know a little bit more about your internal tug of war between these two dimensions that you're constantly battling with.
Such a good question, Bruno. Thank you for asking. Roman lives down the road from me, actually.
Okay. We can bring him in right now.
Right. It's such a good question, and I don't think there's a steady state answer, actually. So I I think this is that the long term prognosis it constantly changes. I think one of the joys about working in this context, I have the great good fortune of working in the cultural sector, that what it does is that I have seen the best of people. I have seen the best of the wit, the wisdom, the community that coming into climate action brings. I would be lying, and I'm trying to be honest here. I would be lying if I didn't feel sometimes so deeply dismal and gloomy that the endless optimism is really irritating. Um, and very counter to the evidence. However, I will say that my optimism is increasing, not diminishing, bizarrely, and that is because you said as you said, I've been in this space for a long time, and it felt like for 10 years, I and other people, I don't want to, this is not just Judys Bicycle, there are others who have been shouting into what has felt like a stormy, dark night with gusty wind just taking these voices away and flinging them into eternity. That has really changed, and that's changed incredibly fast. Suddenly culture and climate has landed, and it's landed really fast, not just with our artists or our activists, but actually with the kind of institutions of culture. I remain profoundly I have a profound faith in the power of the arts and culture and creative industries to drive change. I feel that once we've got the bit between our teeth, which we now have, there is no stopping us. And that taking on that mantle of moral leadership has now begun. And that is an immensely powerful force. And of course, it's not going to happen in a short period of time. That this is an existential dark night of the soul, that more and more people have come through it. I don't think, though, we're going to do it by 2030. And that is the scientific consensus that we need to do it by then. I also think that there's going to be huge loss, huge grief, huge suffering before we get to a state of equilibrium. But we are at least on our way.
Thank you very much, Alison. That answers the question and many others. So I think it's a perfect note.
Yeah, I think if there's no other question, we can leave it with this beautiful ending, in fact. But maybe there is still a question. I don't see any. That's okay. Well, Alison, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inspiring us and having this discussion with us, because it's really important. As I said also in the beginning, I feel that you are an ally in this struggle, and it's good to have allies around you, because sometimes you feel that you're sort of struggling on your own, I might say, and I find it hugely important that we continue this discussion, and also that we share and exchange the methods that we have,
For
and the
sure.
tools and the
Yeah.
instruments. So with this, also a token to everyone who's watching, also after when we publish the recording, to also contact you and be in contact with you at Judys
Very,
Bicycle,
very happy
and to
do
see
that.
all the instruments that you have available that are really, really important for the cultural sector. So I want to thank you very much.
Thank you, Hicham,
And
Bruno,
hopefully we can
and
see you
everybody.
live
Yeah.
someday.
Yeah, definitely look forward to that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alison.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for the public. Thank you, Hamid and Anna and all the technique and everyone, and Bruno. I will leave it with this. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Alice.